You will not believe how far a homeowners association can go until you hear this story. Imagine sitting in your own home, thinking the worst thing your HOA could do is fine you for weeds or parking too close to the curb, and then, one day, two men in tactical gear show up at your door, flashing fake police badges and claiming you're under arrest for violating HOA rules. Sounds insane, right? But that's exactly what happened to Doyle, and what those imposters didn't know was that they had just targeted the one man who could destroy their entire corrupt system. It started on what should have been an ordinary weekend morning in the suburbs, the kind of day when the smell of fresh-cut grass mixes with the hum of sprinklers. Neighbors wave politely and children ride their bikes down quiet cul-de-sacs. Doyle, a man who had always kept to himself and valued the peace of his home, never imagined his world was about to be turned upside down. He had dealt with annoying HOA letters before, warnings about the color of his mailbox or the height of his grass, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. On that morning, as he stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, two men in tactical-style uniforms approached his driveway. Their boots hit the pavement with authority, their vests loaded with gear, radios clipped to their shoulders, and one of them barked out his name with the tone of someone used to being obeyed. But something about the scene felt off, too aggressive, too staged, like actors in a low-budget crime drama. Still, before Doyle could process what was happening, the men announced they were there on official business, claiming he had violated community regulations so severely that he was being placed under arrest. Arrest for what? He laughed at first, thinking this had to be some bizarre prank, but his laugh died quickly when one of the so-called officers produced handcuffs and moved closer. Doyle's instincts kicked in. He was not a man easily intimidated, and something deep inside told him these men weren't who they said they were. He asked for identification, a badge, anything that would prove they were legitimate, but their vague answers and growing impatience only made his suspicions stronger. When one of them reached for his arm, Doyle pulled back sharply and shouted for his neighbors. The sound carried across the street, and soon curious faces peeked out from behind curtains and front doors. Within minutes, phones were out, recording every second of the unfolding chaos. And that's when the fake officers' confidence began to crack. Their rehearsed commands faltered, their movements looked uncertain, and Doyle's refusal to comply turned the spotlight squarely on them. A neighbor, who happened to be a retired police officer, stepped closer and yelled that their uniforms were wrong, their badges fake, and their entire act a sham. The crowd grew bolder, calling out questions, demanding answers, and the imposters panicked. One tried to drag Doyle toward their vehicle, but the resistance was too strong. Doyle planted his feet, refusing to move, and in the struggle, the cuffs slipped from the man's hand, clattering loudly on the pavement like the sound of a lie shattering in plain sight. That moment changed everything. The neighbors no longer watched quietly. They shouted, some even moving toward Doyle to shield him. Someone had already called the real police, and the imposters knew time was running out. They dropped their tough guy act, muttered something about a misunderstanding, and bolted down the street toward their van. But the damage was already done. The entire confrontation had been caught on multiple cameras, and within hours the clips began spreading online, drawing outrage and disbelief. Who would go this far just to intimidate a homeowner? Why would anyone think impersonating police was the right way to enforce HOA rules? For Doyle, the incident was more than a close call. It was the spark that lit the fire, exposing the rot festering behind the carefully polished image of his neighborhood's HOA. The neighborhood was buzzing after the bizarre scene in Doyle's driveway. People who had once minded their own business were suddenly whispering on sidewalks, trading theories in hushed tones, and forwarding the shaky phone videos that had already begun trending online. Doyle sat inside his home that evening, replaying the day in his head, still stunned by how far his HOA had gone. He had known the board members could be pushy, even arrogant, but impersonating police to intimidate him, that crossed a line he never thought possible. And yet, as the adrenaline wore off, something in Doyle shifted. He realized this wasn't just about him. This was about everyone in the community who had been bullied, silenced, or forced into compliance under the HOA's thumb. For years, people had brushed off the letters, the fines, the constant surveillance, telling themselves it was easier to comply than to fight back. But Doyle wasn't wired that way. He filed an official police report, describing every detail of the imposter's actions. The real detectives didn't take long to connect dots. Their investigation uncovered receipts, payments made in cash, and suspicious withdrawals from the HOA's accounts that lined up perfectly with the stunt. As evidence piled up, the ugly truth began to surface. The HOA wasn't just enforcing petty rules. It was running a shadow operation designed to keep residents scared and compliant. Tens of thousands of dollars were missing from the budget. Contracts for landscaping and maintenance had been awarded to companies owned by relatives of board members. And perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators found community funds had been used to purchase hidden surveillance cameras, positioned in ways that made it clear certain homeowners were being specifically targeted. Doyle's name was on that list. The idea that the people elected to maintain order and fairness had instead turned their authority into a weapon shook everyone. At first, residents didn't want to believe it. The HOA president had always been seen as a strong, disciplined leader, strict, yes, but supposedly fair. She carried herself with the air of someone who claimed to have the neighborhood's best interests at heart. But behind closed doors, she had built a small empire of control, rewarding loyal board members with perks and punishing anyone who dared to challenge her authority. Doyle's confrontation exposed her, and the mask began to slip. Local reporters arrived like vultures, setting up cameras on street corners, interviewing anyone willing to talk. Doyle, once a quiet man who preferred to avoid attention, now found himself the reluctant face of resistance. He gave statements on his front lawn while news vans parked nearby. Each night his story aired on television, painting him not as a troublemaker, but as a hero who had refused to bow down to intimidation. The community's trust in the HOA crumbled. Longtime residents recalled moments when they, too, had been threatened or unfairly fined. Younger families admitted they'd always felt watched, uneasy under the gaze of a board that seemed less concerned with beautifying the neighborhood and more obsessed with power. The turning point came during a heated emergency meeting. With nearly every homeowner packed into the clubhouse, the president tried to maintain control, insisting the allegations were exaggerated, the media blowing things out of proportion. But the crowd wasn't buying it. People shouted, demanding answers, waving copies of the police report and screenshots of financial records. Doyle stood and told his story again, this time face-to-face with the woman who had orchestrated the fake arrest. His calm words cut deeper than anger ever could. You abused our trust, and you tried to take away our freedom. The room erupted, not in support of her, but in cheers for him. For the first time in years, the balance of power shifted. The very people who had once feared the board now demanded its removal. The courtroom became the final stage for the HOA's downfall. By the time the case reached trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements showing cash withdrawals with no explanation, testimony from contractors who admitted they had been pressured into inflating invoices, and even confessions from the imposters who had pretended to be police officers. They revealed they had been handed cash in envelopes, told to scare Doyle straight and make an example out of him. The HOA's president sat at the defense table, her confident persona stripped away, while prosecutors laid out a story of greed and intimidation. Residents filled the benches, some angry, others still in disbelief that the very people they had trusted to maintain their community had orchestrated such corruption. Doyle testified calmly, describing not just the fake arrest, but years of harassment, letters, demanding changes to his property, fines with no basis, and the constant feeling of being watched. His words painted a picture of a man pushed too far, and a neighborhood trapped under an iron grip. The judge listened intently, and when it came time for sentencing, she didn't hold back. Calling the scheme a betrayal of trust and a danger to public safety, she dissolved the HOA board entirely, placing the community under temporary state oversight until new elections could be held. Several board members faced criminal charges, embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy among them. The once proud president was sentenced to prison, her carefully crafted reputation collapsing in a matter of minutes. Outside the courthouse, Doyle once again faced cameras. But this time, the tone was different. He wasn't just the man who had stood up against bullies. He was now seen as the whistleblower who had helped dismantle a corrupt system. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now shook his hand, thanking him for his courage. Parents told their children his story, framing it as a lesson in standing up for what is right. The neighborhood began to change. Without the old board's heavy hand, residents started to breathe again. Rules were revised, fines were reduced, and surveillance cameras were taken down. For the first time in years, people felt free to plant flowers, park their cars without fear, and decorate their homes without being cited. Doyle watched from his porch as kids played in the street, laughter replacing the quiet tension that had once gripped the community. But even as life slowly returned to normal, and what happens when it goes unchecked. Word of his story spread beyond the city, other neighborhoods across the country. Upon hearing about the fake police stunt and the court case, began to look more closely at their own associations. Some found similar patterns of abuse, and Doyle's name often came up as an example of why standing up matters. In the end, his story lived on as a warning. The real danger to freedom sometimes wears a friendly smile, hides behind paperwork, and claims to act for your own good. But when pushed too far, even the quietest neighbor can become the loudest voice for justice.